And it's been a minute since I made one of these and went on a walk. I've been doing something else during my normal time where I go on a walk for the past couple days, so it's probably been almost a week. And this time I wanted to talk about a subject that I was speaking to a friend about recently, and he was saying, I'm a perfectionistic person, and I've noticed that some people of this psychological type, I've noticed that when I talk to these people, they also have this problem with perfectionism. And also, this must have been like 2 weeks ago. I was watching someone's Instagram that I like, and he was talking about liking having a competitive player because he's like a coach now for football, and he's like, I really like it when somebody's driven and they're competitive because that guy's going to do what it takes to get good. And I was just thinking, yeah, that makes sense for sports, but how do you connect that to art? Because for sports, like a lot of the things are so cut and dry. It's like, all right, well, this general strategy is to score the most points. But how do you get that same measure with art, And the question that my friend had was, how come I keep running into all these people of the same type that have this problem with perfectionism? And I think in general, it's like from one perspective, it's like, okay, well, the type that he was talking about, they're all introverts. And it's like, well, if your main strength is something that's subjective to you, as is the case for all introverts, then it's hard to gamify because you don't have anything objective to look to and say, and keep score, Whereas a lot of other types, their strength is something that's extroverted, so they have something objective to point to and keep score on. And I feel like almost like a prostitute, taking this conversation that I wanted to have and connecting it to type. But that's kind of how it started today, was my friend wanted to talk about psychological type stuff. But I think it's definitely deeper than that, because from the one perspective, you could say, well, I'm an introvert, so I'm artistic and I'm working on something that's subjective. And then you also have that other viewpoint, which is like, okay, well, what objectively did you produce? Are you lazy, or are you are you a perfectionist? Because somebody that looks at things objectively can say, well, you're not a perfectionist, you're just someone who has a hard time getting to doing what you need to do, and you don't really materialize much. And I'm not asking the question, I'm not saying that it's like a real dichotomy that exists objectively. I'm not saying, well, you objectively either are lazy or you are a perfectionist. It's just the viewpoint that you take. Like if you're looking at it from the extroverted perspective and saying, well, I'm a competitive person and I know what it takes to get good at something. It's like, all right, well, that's an extremely objective stance that you're taking, because you're saying that just by whatever you're arbitrarily keeping score of, that's real. And if somebody's doing something where they're not keeping a score, it's not real. So they can't really be a perfectionist, or they can't have this thing called perfectionism that's getting in their way of materializing something. They're just lazy and they need to get to doing what they need to do. For example, you could be a musician and you could consider yourself to have perfectionistic tendencies, so you don't really create too many songs, and people can look at you as like a huge loser because, let's say, you're in your mid-30s, you've been a musician your whole life, and you haven't really made a lot of money off of your craft. But let's say you take the same person, and that person in their late 30s makes a one-hit, they become like a one-hit wonder, like they make an album or they make a single that just really gets a lot of radio play, then all of that is reversed. So you can really see that even though people look at these things objectively, people are like, okay, well, this art is good because it's made a lot of money, or it's got a lot of radio plays or whatever. It's like, it's a strong pull for a lot of people to look at things that way. It's like, if you look at people's lives where that's happened, something like that, like they've just all of a sudden, people looked at them as like a huge loser and then they get fame overnight. It's like, you can obviously see that the two perspectives are equally valid. The introvert perspective and the extrovert perspective. And I think it's a really interesting question to ask, or to look at things that way and be like, okay, well, is that person just lazy, or are they just like a fucking loser, or are they a perfectionist so they don't make too much of their, they spend a lot of time honing their craft, but they don't spend a lot of time producing things with their craft. And it's just interesting because to survive, you have to produce shit that people objectively value. Because like for one, money is gamified. So most people's jobs are gamified. Like almost any job you can think of, any career is gamifying something so that you can get objective value out of it. That's why people in the West, we care so much about sports, and athletes make athletes are some of the people that make like the most money. If you think about jobs, like an athlete makes a shit ton of money. And one of the reasons why is because we care so much about things being gamified. But at the end of the day, just because you have something that you can gamify and you can look at with an objective lens and say that you've produced something, it doesn't mean it's going to be fulfilling. And I think I've talked about this before in the video on burnout. And I would say someone like that, like that's how you know someone is a true artist, is if they don't really, like a true artist doesn't really look at their craft in terms of it being gamified. And I'm not even really sure where I'm going with this, but like the main topic, it was about perfectionism. So my friend said, I have a bunch of INFJ friends, and or every INFJ person I meet is a perfectionist. And well, you can say, well, they're introverts, they're dominant introverts, so they don't place too much importance on objectively gamifying whatever they're doing. They put a lot of subjective value into it. So a person who doesn't care too much about these objective things would be seen as a lazy person, whereas like my friend who on his Instagram, he was saying, I want somebody that's competitive because they know they're going to get good at it. And that stuck with me, because I was like, well, you can be good at something even if you're not necessarily competitive in the way that we look at it, or we look at competitiveness through the guise of sports. And I feel like it's not to say that sports are shallow. It's just so easy to objectively look at sports and say what's good and what's not. Whereas with art, it's so much more difficult. So I think in a sense, you actually have to be way more of a competitive person than an athlete in order to be good at your craft, because you have to look at what everybody else is saying, or like you have to look at the value that everybody else is putting on something that you're producing and say you don't care about it, because you care about what subjectively from yourself, what value you put on it, more than what other people think. And I also feel like this whole concept where people are saying they're perfectionists is like born out of our culture, really placing so much objective value in things. It reminds me, or not reminds me, but it kind of just gives me the feeling of like a stress response. Like people are saying, I'm a perfectionist, and it's such a problem for me to be perfectionist, because you're like, obviously the reason why you're saying it's a problem is because you're not producing so much. But some people just, it's natural for you to just not care so much about what other people think about what you're doing. So, I wonder how much of this shit comes out of insecurity, of people feeling like they need to produce something. And I also don't think it's not just the pressure to produce something. It's the pressure to produce something that will be easily consumable to masses of people. So it's like a true artist can look at whatever they're doing and their craft and be like, I know this is good because of my own principles, or how much effort I put into it, or how much work I put into it, and also maybe the fact that I like it. Just because masses of people don't necessarily like it doesn't mean it's not good. Whereas like the gamified, the sports way of looking at something, and the like what our culture mostly values is being, it's not to say it's good or bad, is like the extroverted position and being like, well, how do I know it's going to be good? And it's like to an introvert, at least like me, it looks like a stress. It looks like a rat race. It's like, it's like stressful. Millions of people didn't like my post. That means it's bad. It's like, well, who the fuck cares? Like, shouldn't you be asking yourself whether it's good first? Like, why even do it? Like, and me as a hardcore introvert, it's like hard for me to look at the other perspective and give it its due. But it's just, that was the thing that I was thinking when I first heard. Like, one of the things that came to mind when I first heard the coach, he was like, I like this competitive guy. It's like, well, what the competitive guy is really doing is he has this hardcore insecurity about what other people are thinking when they're watching him do something. And I think people find that so important because, like, in an actual fight or an actual conflict or an actual struggle, there is an objective measure, and that is like the pain that's caused to yourself or the pain that's inflicted on someone else. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so common to find things like that, and art isn't. Because in a war, it's like, okay, well, did we lose or did we win? Well, I mean, are you still alive? Because if you and your team are dead, then you lost, and that's, that's meant a lot more to people. I think especially during like the early years of the human species, like that there was actual evolutionary pressure to gamify what we were doing. But then you look at these people in modern day who are trying to find their self-worth in the gamification of whatever they're doing and basically their entire life, whether it's on social media or just in their day-to-day life, like in real life and their job. And you can look at these people and just like, and you just know, like, I don't have to go and objectively verify. You just know they're missing something, and they're looking, and it's not always in a negative light. Like, it's not like, oh, they're missing something and so they feel terrible. It's just like, maybe at the extremes, yes, but even in normal circumstances, it's like, yeah, they're just missing something. They're missing that subjective factor that tells them, what they should be doing instead of looking at what other people want them to be doing. And I feel like that's something, I know that's something that by definition comes easier to the introvert, is deciding, what decisions to make or, what they want to do based not on what other people are saying they should do or how other people are responding to what they're doing, but whatever they feel like. And to what my friend was saying, he's like, oh, well, these people of a particular type that I run into, like, why is it that, I feel like they have this, they consider their perfectionism a problem? And I think it's probably because they're naturally probably more artistic or more subjective or more introverted people, like however you want to word it. They're more one way, and the society at large is more objective, extroverted, and gamified. So it may be the case that there are people that are pretending like they're something that they're not, and that's why they feel like they have this problem. Because the extroverted people or the extroverted viewpoint is like, you're not perfectionist, you're just lazy. Whereas the subjective viewpoint is, well, none of that matters, because that's not even, you don't even think of things like you're being lazy with your craft, because it's like, how are you supposed to be competitive with it? There's no score, there's no objective score that everybody can look at and be like, yes, this is good, whatever the hell, whatever your craft is. It's more whether or not you like it, which should be simple, but I feel like the general atmosphere in some areas can be so manic that it's overlooked. And I put it in typological, quote unquote. I put it in Jung's typological terms just because my friend had asked that question. But anything from Jung's typology, you should be able to translate into like regular language. So when I say introvert, I mean somebody that's more artistic, because whatever they value is more subjective, which is almost the same way decisions are made in an artistic field. Whereas the extroverts, the things that they value are more sporty and more gamified, because whatever they're looking at has an objective classifier. So the summary here is he's saying, okay, well, I have these friends that are for perfectionist, and perfectionist isn't like a positive term in our culture. Well, and the reason it's not is because it's associated with not finishing shit and not producing stuff. But I think the reason is that people feel like they have this problem, or a problem even to begin with, is they're like, why am I so subjective? Why am I so artistic? I should be more productive. It's like, well, you're a person that is artistic, so you should see that as a strength, not as a weakness, not as, oh, I'm being perfectionist. It's like, welcome to the club, man, you're just an artist. And people even get more manic with it, because if you were to tell somebody that, they'd be like, they would then use being an artist as an objective classifier. They'd be like, well, how do I know if I'm a good artist? it's like, well, that's even, again, looking at it through an extroverted viewpoint. You're still trying to gamify and put a score to it when there is no score. It's art. So if that is something, if you're listening to this and that is something that you feel like you have a problem with, like being a little bit more artistic and being a little bit more subjective and a little bit less gamey with whatever you're doing, then, I mean, use it to your advantage. Get some benefit out of it. You know, you shouldn't look at yourself as just a person that is, just not productive, because that not everything should be made for mass consumption. And at least that's the way I look at it. So if you've made it this far, thanks for listening. This is another just kind of ramble. It's going to be called Extroverts and Introverts, and Extroverts, Introverts, and Perfectionism. And maybe I'll revisit this topic. And I'll definitely have something else in the next video. So I'll see you guys later. And actually, I want to add this last thing. I was saying about, like, in human evolution, it was very important to gamify things, but it's also evident that you needed to have the subjective factor, otherwise we wouldn't have it. You needed art during human evolution also, because for your body, it's like, okay, what's a good workout? Good workout is a workout that makes me more fit over the long term. Like, if I'm doing something and it's an exercise and it doesn't make it easier for me to survive, it's a shitty exercise. Like, if I'm gonna die at 50 because I eat terribly and I'm not really working out, it's like, well, that's a bad exercise objectively. But the summary to this whole rant is that there are subjective things that you can't gamify that are also good for your psychological well-being. And they're made for you. They're things that you make for yourself. You can't make them for other people to, well, other people can consume them, but even their consumption of it is still subjectively based. They get out of it whatever they get out of it. It's not something that you've made for a specific purpose. And I think I'll leave it there.